The sun went out when Jesus died. 3 hours. Not a flicker, not a cloud passing over. The sky above Jerusalem went dark at high noon, the brightest point of the day, the busiest week of the Jewish calendar, and it stayed dark until 3 in the afternoon. Matthew records it, Mark records it, Luke records it, and almost every person who reads those verses treats them like stage directions, something dramatic God did to set the mood, the way a film score swells before somebody dies. But in the Hebrew Bible, a sun that fails at midday is not a mood, it is a warning. It had already happened once before, in Egypt, right before the last plague fell, and it had been prophesied at least 3 times by men who described a day when the sun would go down at noon, and the grief would be like mourning for an only son. The darkness at the cross was not God reacting to what was happening. It was his signature on a document he had written centuries before the cross existed, and that document had 3 clauses, each one written in a different century, by a different hand, in a different kind of darkness. Every one of them came due at noon on a Friday in Jerusalem. We're going to read all 3. We'll start in Egypt, move to the prophet Amos in the 8th century before Christ, and end with something God did in the dark while Abraham slept, something so binding that 2,000 years later, the dark came back because the oath came due. Matthew chapter 27 verse 45 puts it plainly. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. 3 Gospels, same detail, same hours. None of them treats it as an atmosphere. Neither should we. Before we get to those 3 clauses, we need to slow down on what the text actually says, because there's a detail buried in Luke's account that scribes spent centuries quietly smoothing over. All 3 synoptic Gospels record the darkness with unusual precision. Mark gives us the time frame. The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour, roughly 9 in the morning. Then Mark chapter 15 verse 33, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, noon to 3, 6 hours total on the cross. The first 3 were in full daylight. That's when the mocking happened, the soldiers gambling for his clothes, the sign above his head, the conversation with the thief. Then the darkness came, and the record goes almost silent. The Greek word Matthew and Mark use for darkness is skotos, the ordinary word, nothing unusual about it. The phrase around it, epipasan ten gen, can mean over all the land or over all the earth, and the grammar doesn't settle which. But Luke gives us something the other 2 don't, and this is the part most readers walk right past. Luke's earliest manuscripts, the oldest and most respected copies we have, don't use the flat word for darkened. They use a word built on the verb eklepo. That's the root of our English word eclipse. It means the sun failed, the sun gave out, and that's a problem, because a solar eclipse during Passover is not unlikely, it's impossible. Passover falls on the 14th of Nisan, a full moon. A full moon means the earth is between the sun and the moon. A solar eclipse requires the opposite arrangement, and even if you could somehow get one, the longest a total eclipse lasts at any point on the ground is about 7 minutes. The Gospels describe 3 hours. So what happened in the manuscript history is exactly what you would expect. Later scribes copying Luke saw the astronomical impossibility, recognized the difficulty, and quietly swapped the word for a safer one, which is precisely why most textual scholars believe the harder reading is the original. When copyists change a text, they change it in one direction, toward what makes sense to them, almost never the other way. Luke wasn't writing an astronomy report. He was describing what people saw. The light source failed, and whatever happened over Jerusalem that afternoon, the Gospels are not describing a predictable orbital event. So the question isn't whether the darkness happened. The question is what it meant. And to answer that, we need to open a document that God started writing 15 centuries before the cross, in Egypt, on the night everything changed. The first clause. Turn back to Exodus chapter 10. 9 plagues have already fallen on Egypt. The 9th is the strangest, and it's the one right before the last. God tells Moses to stretch out his hand toward heaven, and darkness falls over the land of Egypt. The Hebrew word here is not Layla, the ordinary word for nighttime. It's Hoshek. Darkness as a condition. Darkness as something that presses in. The text says it could be felt, and it gives us 3 specific details most readers skim past. For 3 days, no one saw anyone else, No one rose from where he was sitting, and no one moved. That's not just an absence of light. That's a paralysis. An entire civilization halted mid-motion. Egypt sat still for 72 hours, in a dark it could feel on its skin. Egypt's supreme deity was a sun god. The 9th plague struck directly at him, and it landed immediately before the final blow. Because what comes next, in Exodus 11 and 12, is the death of the firstborn, and the blood of a lamb on the doorposts, and the first Passover. Hold the sequence in mind. Darkness, then the firstborn, then a lamb, and blood, and deliverance. Now go back to Golgotha, Passover week, noon. Darkness falls over the land. In Egypt, the darkness fell, and Israel had light in their dwellings. The plague passed over the covenant people. God's firstborn was spared. Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, records what God told Moses to say to Pharaoh, "Israel is my son, my firstborn." In Egypt, God shielded his firstborn son and struck Egypt. At the cross, the arrangement inverts. The darkness settles over Jerusalem, over the covenant people, over the holy city, at its holiest week. And the one inside the darkness is the Son. Paul calls him exactly that in Colossians chapter 1, the firstborn over all creation. In Egypt, the firstborn walked out of the darkness alive because a lamb had died in his place. At the cross, the lamb is the firstborn, and there is no substitute behind him. The pattern from Exodus doesn't repeat here. It reverses, and the covenant family, who had been protected by the blood on their doorposts 15 centuries earlier, watches the blood get put on the wood instead. The God of Exodus and the God of Golgotha are the same God, doing the same thing with the same signs. The second time, he absorbs it himself. That's the first clause. The second was written 7 centuries before the cross, by a man who never expected to be a prophet. Amos was a farmer, a herdsman, and a tender of sycamore fruit from a small town called Tekoa in Judah. God pulled him out of the field and sent him north, to the wealthy, comfortable, religiously busy kingdom of Israel in the 8th century before Christ. He preached to a nation that had turned worship into a cover for injustice. The same feasts God was about to call this darkness down on. And then, in chapter 8, God tells Amos what's coming. Amos chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. "I will make the sun go down at noon, and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feasts into mourning, and I will make it like mourning for an only son." Put that next to the cross. The sun goes down at noon. That's the 6th hour. The earth darkens in broad daylight. A feast turns to mourning, and Passover is a feast. And the grief of that day is compared to mourning for an only son. The Hebrew word there is yahid. It doesn't just mean only child in a counting sense. It means singular, irreplaceable, the one you cannot lose and recover from. And there is one other place in the Hebrew Bible where that word carries this kind of weight. Genesis chapter 22, verse 2, where God says to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love." Same Hebrew word, same setup, a father sending an only son up a mountain to die. Amos wasn't alone. Joel chapter 2 says, "The sun will be turned to darkness before the great and awesome day of the Lord." Zephaniah chapter 1 calls it a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Isaiah chapter 13 adds that the stars will not give their light. 4 different prophets, spread across 3 centuries, all describing the same event using the same image. And the image is always specific. Not sunset, not eclipse, not a storm. A sun that dies at noon while the earth is still expecting light. In the prophetic canon, that image is the signature of the day of the Lord, the day God finally settles accounts. So when the sun failed over Jerusalem, anyone who knew the prophets knew what was being announced. Judgment Day had arrived. It landed. It fell with full weight. It just fell where no one expected. Isaiah chapter 53 says something people rush past because it sounds harsh. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. And Paul puts it in the plainest language anyone has ever used. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. "He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." The day of the Lord came down on one man at noon, outside a city wall, and he was the only one there who didn't deserve it. That's the second clause. The third goes further back than Egypt. and it explains why the darkness happened in the first place. Go back to Abram, before the name change, before Isaac, when he's an old man with no children, and a promise he can't see how God intends to keep. In Genesis chapter 15, God tells him to bring animals and cut them in half and lay the pieces in 2 rows with a path between them. That sounds strange to us. It wasn't strange to Abram. This was how covenants were sealed in the ancient Near East. We have Hittite treaty texts and the Mari letters centuries earlier describing the same ceremony. Both parties to an agreement would walk between the divided animals, and the walk was an oath spoken with your whole body. It meant, let what was done to these animals be done to me if I break this covenant. Scholars call it a self-maledictory oath. You are calling down a curse on yourself if you fail. If you walked between the pieces, you were staking your life on the words. The pieces are laid out. Abram drives off the birds of prey. And then Genesis chapter 15, verse 12. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. The Hebrew is Ema Hasheka Gedola, terror and a great darkness. The word Hasheka is the feminine form of the same root as the Hoshek from Egypt. Same family of darkness, thick, pressing, dreadful. Then verse 17, a smoking oven and a burning torch passed between the pieces. Read that verse and count how many walk. Abram doesn't. He's asleep. He's on the ground, in the dark, unable to participate. God, appearing as fire and smoke, walks the path alone, both directions. God takes the oath for both parties. Think about what that means. In the most binding language that culture possesses, God is saying, if this covenant fails from either side, the penalty falls on me. If Abraham's descendants break faith, I will pay for it. He is putting himself under the curse for a covenant Israel has not yet had the chance to break, and he is doing it while the only human witness lies unconscious in the dark. He swore it in the dark, alone, with no one to hold him to it but himself. Now, come forward 2,000 years. A hill outside Jerusalem, a descendant of Abraham hanging on a Roman cross. The sun fails at midday. Darkness covers the land for 3 hours. The covenant did fail. Israel broke it. The prophets say so at length. And the God who swore in the darkness that he would carry the penalty personally came back into the darkness and paid it. The darkness at the cross was not God reacting to the crucifixion. It was God keeping a promise he made in the dark 2,000 years earlier. That's the third clause, which explains why the darkness came. But it doesn't yet explain why it ended. And that answer is in the last thing that happened before he died. 3 hours of silence. Almost nothing was recorded from inside those hours. During the daylight, mocking, soldiers gambling, conversations with criminals, words to his mother. Then the darkness came, and the record goes quiet. Then, right at the end, at the 9th hour, one cry. Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. And he cried in Aramaic, not the Hebrew of the psalm, but the everyday language of Galilee, the language he grew up speaking. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me? That's not a cry of despair. It's a quotation, the opening line of Psalm 22. And the second verse of that psalm reads, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season, and I am not silent. On a hill, where the daylight had become night, he was quoting the one psalm in the Hebrew Bible that names both conditions in the same breath. The 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, was the hour of the evening sacrifice at the temple. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, places the afternoon offering in that mid-afternoon window. The Mishnah gives slightly different times, and the sources vary by an hour or two, but they all land in the same stretch of the day. At the moment Jesus cried out and died, priests a short distance away were standing at the altar, and Passover lambs were being slaughtered by the thousands for the meal that evening. There's a version of this moment you may have heard preached, that the high priest cried out, "It is finished," over the Passover lamb at the very instant Jesus said it from the cross. It's a striking image. It's also not in Josephus, not in the Mishnah, not in any ancient record of temple practice. It traces to modern books, not ancient ones. The real connection doesn't need the help. Jesus died at the hour of sacrifice. That's what the text itself gives us. Then Matthew, chapter 27, verse 51. The veil of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom. Two things happened at the 9th hour. The darkness lifted, and the curtain that had separated worshippers from the presence of God for 1,000 years split down the middle. The sky came back, and the door opened. That's the signature. Not the darkness alone, but the darkness ending in the moment the way in was thrown open. The debt was paid. The receipt is a torn curtain. 3 clauses, 1 document, 1 signature. Now, here is why this matters where you are sitting. You don't need to be standing on a hill outside Jerusalem to know what it feels like when the light goes out. And what happened at the cross was not just theology, settled at a historical altitude you'll never reach. It settled the specific shape of what to do with darkness when you find yourself inside one. Maybe you're watching this from a season where the prayers stopped making sound. You still pray, you haven't quit, but somewhere in the last few months, the words started hitting the ceiling and staying there. You open the Bible, lay, and the page sits flat. You read the verses and nothing moves, and you haven't told anyone. Because how do you say, "I think God left the room," without it sounding like you're losing your faith? So you don't say it. You just keep showing up, and you keep it to yourself, and the silence gets one day thicker every week. Then again, the faith might not be what's cracked. What's cracked might be something you did, something specific, not a theological category, but an actual Tuesday afternoon you can still see when you close your eyes. And you've been carrying it for so long now that it's become part of the furniture. You've stopped thinking about forgiving yourself. You've accepted that this is the weight you walk with, and you've gotten very good at functioning under it. Nobody around you knows it's there. You've made sure of that. Or it could be quieter than either of those. Nothing dramatic happened. You just noticed, somewhere in the last year, that Sunday started feeling like a task. That worship became attendance. That the version of you sitting in the pew and the version of you driving home are 2 different people, and you don't know which one is real. You're not angry at God. You're not doubting. You're just going through it. And going through it has become so normal that you've forgotten there was ever anything else. Jesus quoted Psalm 22, "From inside the darkness." He wasn't describing something he observed from a distance. He was describing something he was living through, which means the God you are talking to, from wherever you are talking to him, the silence, the weight, the going through the motions, is not unfamiliar with the room you are in. He was in one just like it. Not because the darkness wasn't real. It was real enough to shut the sky for 3 hours. He didn't stay in it because the oath he swore in Genesis 15 was stronger than the darkness he swore it in. You are not someone God forgot in the dark. You are someone God entered the dark to reach. At the 9th hour, the darkness ended. It didn't fade the way evening comes. It ended because it was measured, bounded. 3 hours, and not one more. And on the far side of it, the curtain lay open, where it had hung sealed for 1,000 years. The darkness was never a reaction. It was a return, God coming back to the dark he had sworn in, because the promise required it. 3 clauses, written across 15 centuries, all coming due on the same afternoon. If you know someone sitting in the dark right now, someone who wouldn't use those words but you'd recognize them if you saw them, send them this. Sometimes, the most important thing a person can hear is that the dark has an end. The sun didn't go out over Jerusalem by accident. It went out because a debt 15 centuries in the making finally came due, and when the light came back, it was paid in full.